Hello and welcome to The Puzzle and Snuggles Part 1, the most recent album from Devin Townsend. This is admittedly quite late for a few reasons. One, over the Christmas period, my laptop died, and the backup one just was not sufficient for getting all the editing done. It was a trial just to get an updates video done using it. The other thing is, this album is weird. In fact, it's actually been described by Devin Townsend as not really being an album as much as a audio and visual representation for the chaos that was affected by the 2020 pandemic, or the ongoing pandemic as it seems to have been. It's a means by which he sought to purge himself creatively of every idea he had, because when he was trying to work on other projects, he was finding himself incredibly distracted, and instead of fighting that, he decided to go down the path of least resistance and embrace this confusion. And so made an album that very effectively represents that. Like, you'll come across a lot of artists who will try to do songs that are meant to theme with chaos and things like that, but none of them will actually feel like an audio representation of what chaos is. Just this nascent confluence of everything and nothing at the same time. To this end, what was afforded was Devin bringing in close to 50 other artists and production people and all that sort of thing, including frequent flyers Morgan Agren, who worked with him on Casualties of Cool and Empath for the drums, Shay Ami Duval, who has been a frequent collaborator with Devin since Casualties of Cool, possibly, actually, I want to say since Ghost, possibly earlier than that. I know they've been collaborating for a while though. Steve Vai, who is a long-term friend and collaborator with Devin, and Mike Keneally, who was essentially headhunted to help realise the sound for Empath, the last album. What was intriguing for me is that whilst it is meant to be representative of chaos and everything therein, I found it to have quite a calming effect on me. On my initial listen, I was having some pretty severe anxiety attacks, but during it, because it has such a jarring nature and there are so many times where you're going, oh, this bit reminds me of this, I couldn't remain in that toxic headspace. It meant I was able to just ride it out, and by the end of it, I was calmed. So, without further ado, let's get to the songs. First, we have Chromatic Ridge. Now, this is very much a start as we mean to continue in terms of how it goes from one movement and style and sound to another. It begins with effectively a sort of blending of Blade Runner's soundtrack mixed with 2001: A Space Odyssey and Devin's albums Ghost and Casualties of Cool, with a lot more sort of keyboard and synth sounds going into it, and harmonica effects bleeding through every so often. It initially has a much more serene and almost floating sound, and initially you're sort of like, okay, so we're going for a sort of world music kind of vibe. And then as it progresses, it becomes slightly more dream-like, and you have vocal effects bleeding through and cheering, and there's odd samples that turn up here and there, and all the while you're just thinking, okay, this is a bit odd, but I'm still understanding it. And you kind of get this feeling of someone who's right on the precipice of falling into a deep unconscious confusion. Not entirely clear on where they are in the world, which very much feels reflective of the ultimate mission statement of the album. From there, we go to Life is But a Dream, which has this intriguing sort of meditative cycling refrain of saying if life is but a dream, and it feels like it's drawing upon elements of the likes of Transcendence and Sky Blue with a triumphant, almost euphoric sound. Incorporating this whole concept of if life is but a dream, then make it the most wonderful and exciting life that you can. As it progresses though, it gradually begins to deteriorate and become almost nightmarish in effect. Almost like it's representing how the start of the year seemed like it could have potential and hope, and then by the end of it you were just drained of all energy and all you could see was the chaos going on around you. To represent that, you have the calmer instrumentation giving way to much harsher tones with stronger, heavier guitar work and drums bleeding through, and eventually leading way into the next song. So next we have Yucky Lung, which essentially is a bridge into the more unfettered, uncontrolled chaos that can result when 45 musicians are all encouraged to do whatever they want. It essentially sounds like if you took Empath, sampled it, reversed those samples, and mixed it with Terrier. Essentially feels like representative of the whole concept of Devin Townsend being constantly distracted and instead of fighting it, going with the path of least resistance. It is very effective for giving you a true idea of what we're in store for the rest of the album. I call it a sort of bridge because It's about the same length as the following song, being about just over 1 minute and 20 seconds. And they kind of feel like complementing part 1 and part 2 to each other.
No, that was good enough.
Next we have Kitten Head, which basically sounds like a nightmare carnival. Like, I could genuinely see this being used as music in a horror movie for some demented circus. And it strongly reinforces the concept of nightmarish chaos. At the same time, reinforces this understanding of where the chaos is coming from. With that in mind, it makes it easier to address this chaos and talk about it, essentially. This essentially does come across like a conversation of his own personal confusion, the confusion everyone is experiencing, everything like that. And Kitten Head, in just over 1 minute and 20 seconds, paints this picture of what he is ultimately going for, to try to decipher everything that's weighing down on everyone. As he said in the liner notes, take it easy, but take it. From there, it becomes more like the nightmare is slowly easing out into a dream. With the next song, Shark in the Ice, which has this feeling of almost an art installation sound, but with slightly harsher guitar work. It follows the pattern. There's not much of a change in overall sound from the previous song, but what really rounds it out and makes it something identifiably its own is the inclusion of Shayami Dorval's and Devin's vocals. They really have this nice ethereal effect that gives more of this dreamlike sense to it and very effectively complements the instrumentation going on. There's not that much active singing going on this album, so when it turns out you do notice it more. It reinforces the effect the album ultimately has. The sort of like, oh, there's somebody singing it. It creates another layer and gives this extra tonality to it that you don't get with a lot of other albums. Again, it flows very nicely onto the next song. Next is Devil in the Details. This is the shortest song on the album, being 58 seconds. It feels like a blending of Devin Townsend project era, specifically Deconstruction, blended with elements of Casualties of Cool. It continues very nicely from Shark in the Ice, whilst still identifiably being its own piece, and generally has this overall feel of being a critical self-analysis of what it's like to be living in a state of constant chaos and uncertainty, and very effectively bridges the gap between Shark in the Ice and the next song. Next we have Hammerhead Sugarplum. Now this opens up feeling very much like travelling through a long winding passage in a dark, dense forest. constantly being haunted by strange whispers that are represented by the odd inflections of horn sound that permeate throughout the opening minute. And as you get to the end of this passage, you finally come across this almighty, bizarre and yet welcoming parade to contrast with the Nightmare Carnival from earlier. It actually put me in mind of this one anime film called Paprika, which, those who know the film, if you listen to the song, you'll probably know where I'm coming from. But for those who don't, Paprika is a very strange film that is kind of like if you took the various sort of plugging yourself into the internet type films, although still being aware of it, and made them do a lot of LSD. Like, a lot. It feels like you've come across this very jaunty, very joyous Mardi Gras parade that is all kinds of bizarre. I could almost imagine the creatures from Labyrinth turning up in it, that sort of thing. It has occasions of the sort of sound of magic dance, and as it progresses, it kind of winds out to give you this sense of euphoric well-being and a moment of clarity in the confusion, to just sit and be and think over the good times that have been had despite the chaos that is currently going around. And again, we get into where this album came from, you know. He described it as being very much like they were slow time in jam sessions during the online discussions and playing across the internet, everything like that. And it very much comes across in songs like this, where you just sort of, you can imagine they're going back and forth and just getting into the groove of things. And as they wind down, they're sort of like, yeah, that really worked. And the next song feels like it encapsulates that feeling of having done well with the work you've created. From there, we have Me and the Moon. Now this once again draws upon some of the darker elements seen in albums like Casualties of Cool. The backstory there, Casualties of Cool, is all about a guy who ends up on this dead planet, and comforted by a record player as his life is being drained away. That's a very summarised version, but we don't have time to get into it. If you want me to do a full review of the album, make a comment, I'm up for it. I love that album, so no problems there. It very much has this feeling of people in a jam session who are just finding their way, they're getting the groove again. It feels like a bunch of friends just having a good time with the music they're creating. It has this natural, fluid, explicable progression compared to other songs on the album, with more of a layering effect of opening with guitars, introducing other instruments like the drums, keyboard, everything like that, and slowly winding out as it goes. But all the while, there's ever so slightly these moments where you're sort of like, I'm not sure how this is going to progress. This could just keep on going how it is, or it might lean into some of the harsher sounds that I'm hearing as it's going. And then it gets to the next song. So next we have Anxiety in Pajamas. Once again we have a song that really brings out what the album's overall intent is, because whilst it has an overall calmer sound compared to the rest of the album, aside from Me and the Moon, there's these strange slams and jolts that permeate throughout the song that really feel perfectly encapsulate the idea that for as calm and at ease as you might think you are, there's going to be something that's jarring, and you're always going to be looking around the corner and expecting something to go wrong. The title in itself, it's sort of like Devin joking about during one of his online gigs how he hadn't taken off his pajama pants in all that time. So it really felt like it was sort of reflecting on how we've all been in the state of we've been trying to relax and just slummocking around in our pajamas, everything like that, and at the same time we can't, because we're just waiting for the other shoe to drop and just the next horrible thing to happen. And as a consequence, it flows very perfectly into the next song. Next is the Yugas, or Yugus. I'm not sure about the pronunciation. If anyone can suggest or guide me or correct me, please comment, because I never knew about this until listening to this album. But if I'm understanding things correctly from the brief bit of research I did on Wikipedia, the Yugas are world ages, ones that last for exceptionally long times. And supposedly we are currently in the Kali Yuga, which is meant to be the worst of the Yugas, and ultimately comes to an end as the consequence of a great cataclysm that is brought about when humanity's virtues are at their nadir, and ultimately happens to re-establish Dharma, the Hindu concept of mind expansion and societal connection and inclusivity. Knowing Devin, this is probably a very exacting and deliberate commentary on where we are as a people at the moment. This is a minuscule explanation of an incredibly elaborate concept that influenced an amazingly nuanced and strange song that is designed to question the concepts of reality, identity, connection, media consumption, and motivation. It builds and swells and has this almost host planets feel to it, specifically Uranus and Pluto, mixed with the likes of Pink Floyd's earlier work, particularly several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pict. It's a really effective piece that has this very nice, emphatic, recurring refrain of someone talking about their podcast and how it's a #1 listened to podcast because of its audience's actions. And it really feels like it rounds out this whole idea of where we're at the moment. We don't really know. There's no reasonable way of knowing which way we are going. And ultimately feels like it's the end of Act 1. Act 2 leads very effectively on from that. Sparked off with starting off Act 2 of this wild ride is Albert Hall. This very much feels like it's representative of Devin's experiences with performing at the Albert Hall, trying to play it cool, but all the while being unable to contain his inner child and just going, "Whee!" Actual quote from him. This is emphasised by samples from the Z2 concert, and there's some nursery rhyme elements mixed in which really very effectively bring out this sort of almost childlike reacquaintance with the world. And it's very effective in how it's slowly, gradually sped up as the song progresses. And the guitar work here is especially effective in how it very much feels like the guitars are coming in to emphasize this idea of not wanting the experience to end. Like, the guitarists are having so much fun just jamming with this song, and they don't want to see it come to an end. But unfortunately, for that song it does. And we move next to Sarcasm. This feels much more like traditional Devin, but like segments of his career in one song as he tries to make sense of the various periods, going through the more prevalent eras of Strapping Young Lad, Devin Townsend Project, Devin Townsend Band, and his solo work, and affecting upon elements of Casualties of Cool, and to a lesser extent Hummer, which this overall album feels much more in line with the likes of Hummer and DevLab, which he actually described it as a more structured version of DevLab. This ultimately feels like it's a prime example of the overall mission statement of the album, of just purging creatively. It very much gives way to this sense of the assorted musicians all being encouraged to do whatever they want and crafting this amazing soundscape of controlled chaos, with soft keys and synths in the opening giving way to intense guitars and drums, the vocals variating expertly to match. And it ultimately displaying a reactive response to the pressures that the current world climate has placed on all those involved, and ultimately whining out and flowing into the next song with a guitar lick previously heard in Shark in the Ice. It's a very nice sort of coda in that effect. Next is Perfect Owl. This brings the sound down again, having a much more free jazz kind of vibe to it, combined with sound samples that have the effect of being next to a busy street. There's also some Vangelis style synth work going on, and overall it really does give this sense of a bird in flight observing nightlife and making some strange sort of animalistic understanding of it all. Unlike most of the other songs, this one keeps much more singular in structure, almost as though to represent the order that can exist in the chaos. Flows very nicely into the next song. Maybe Over the Void. This calms things down further, turning it into a soundscape for a little while longer. Again, there's Vangelis style influences combined with elements of Ghost, which I can imagine to those who are familiar with Ghost, that might sound a bit odd, and to those who aren't, Ghost is sort of world music-y, so Blade Runner soundtrack, world music. Sounds odd, but it weirdly works. It still maintains this vibe of never being quite certain where it will go, with the inflections of brief, heavy, solemn piano notes that really make you go, is this suddenly going to go really heavy without me knowing? Wonder where this is going to go. And works really effectively with leading to the next song. From there, Light Year Wail. A sense is being made of the chaos. This feels like an almost rock version of Casualties of Cool, which was ostensibly a jazz country fusion album, with slightly harder guitars that layer up. There's constantly the sense of wonder surrounding it, as though someone looking to the stars to make sense of it all. Much like most of the album, it has two parts. The first half being the more come together kind of sound, and I don't mean like the Beatles song, I just mean all encompassing. Everyone needs to come together communally. And the second half being much more transcendental, almost like Tool's Lateralus vibe around it, where you get this feeling of a mind pulsing with ideas, urging you to engage and enjoy them as much as that mind has thinking them up. This very much feels like we are getting a true look into what Devin's mind is like constantly. You really get this sense of he has this creative id that cannot stop, and he wants to encourage everyone else around him to engage with both his and their own, and never let it stop. And as it eases out, it flows nicely to the next song. Frog Flowers is ostensibly a bridge to lead us from the sense that has gradually been made into a familiar form of chaos that we've started to structure better. It has this strange sort of mixture of synth and harmonica sounds going on, and weirdly enough kind of puts me in mind of 80s era Doctor Who. It's an intriguing listen just for the minute and 11 seconds that it goes on for. If there's any takeaway to be had, aside from that the album is interesting, it's this. There is no small song on this album. It's a bit like in a lot of shows you'll say there's no small part. So yeah, Frog Flowers is the last of the sort of bridge songs, as it were, and really works well for getting us to the final chapter of the album, which starts with Mother. This is like if Jethro Tull, Vangelis, Tori Amos and Devin Townsend decided to have an almighty collaboration. And now that I say that, I totally want to hear what would actually happen. This can be seen from two perspectives. The chaos a baby experiences in the womb and how much information it can't make sense of, represented by the drum work in sort of this very rhythmic, quite fast, almost heartbeat sound, and the guitars every so often being quite strained. Or the chaos a mother experiences day to day, being told 1,000 different conflicting pieces of information, all whilst trying to just do her job or do what she needs to do as an individual mother or anything like that. The Wind Out especially is rather intriguing for how much it sounds like a 1920s/30s blues lament, and really brings out this whole idea that everyone was allowed to do whatever they wanted with the album and just explore as many different sounds as they could. I would be very intrigued to hear a Devin Townsend album that was done in the styles of 1920s blues. I can imagine him doing really well with something like that. He's done really well with pretty much every other genre he's ever tried his hand at, so... Blues album when, Devin? And The Wind Out leads nicely onto the next song. Southern Sky Geometry. This again is a much more cohesive song, a slow, whining journey down a long road, possibly returning from the parade that was experienced earlier, and the carnival and everything like that, and just looking to the stars and using it as a way to make sense of all the thoughts that you've had over the course of this time. Every so often coming back to confusion as stars stop making sense briefly, which should be impossible. The stars are always as they are. The only difference in them is the brightness they provide. It brings it all round and acts very effectively as a prelude for the titular song. So here we are, the puzzle. The titular song very much feels like what it implies. Component parts ultimately coming together to make a more complete, cohesive picture. much like what can happen to feelings of chaos and confusion when someone extends an empathetic hand. There's an almost passage of time feeling to this, particularly in how the drumming has a very clock-like rhythm to it. It pulls in reference to previous songs, utilises prior samples, and presents a lot of answers to the questions raised by the album. Especially standout for me is the vocal layering effects going on, almost like someone trying their best to organise hundreds of conflicting and affirming thoughts, as though putting pieces of a puzzle together. This is frequently seen throughout the album, but are especially notable here. And you'd almost expect this to be the last song, but Devin realised that this wasn't how things could end. He realised the last song needed to be sort of bringing all the chaos back and then telling the audience, this chaos is good for you. So we lead on to our last song, Monuments in Glitch. This is coming out on the other side of the chaos, tearing through all the fragmented thoughts, the statues built to ideas that at one time or another might have felt distasteful. This is a rather cool, lifting feel to it, as though flying away from all the doubts and fears holding one back. Almost like Devin is going, you know what? I shouldn't have been worried about just letting my creative id loose and just giving everyone the same opportunities I've afforded myself in just going insane. The drum work is glorious. The guitars really have this nice, simultaneously warm and cold feel to them. They're sort of playing off each other. The keyboard and synths, they really round out the sound. And ultimately, you feel this acceptance of identity. There is a triumphant, encouraging feel to it. Whilst there's still elements of chaos, with glitch-like instrumentation interjecting, it's very scattershot in the placements at times, and then alternates between that and ordered patterns. It's very effective there. There's vocal samples hitting out all over the place that helps to round out the message that despite all the chaos and confusion and isolation and panic, eventually all will come together, that it will all make sense. And ultimately, this song has one true message.
Because your greatness lies in the wake of years of telling yourself that you were not good enough.
With everything that's come about, whether it's loss of job, whether it's issues at home, whether it's just generally being in a situation that leaves you completely confused about your own identity.
That you are not capable, that you are not worthy of being loved.
In his own comical yet loving fashion, he outlines this. And
you needed to know, and now you know.
Just to round out discussing the songs individually, you know what? Devin might as well be the one to say it in one of the lines.
2020, suck it.
Now I have to admit, this album is likely to rub people the wrong way. It's not what you typically expect from anyone, no matter how used to their material you are. But for anyone who's tastes are on the more eclectic side, I would greatly encourage you to give this album a listen. I would say, if you are to give any song on the album a listen just to give you a taster for what you're in store for, give Monuments in Glitch a listen. But yeah, I urge everyone, it's on Spotify, it's on YouTube, you can find it everywhere, so give it a listen. You can tell Devin put a lot of earnest love and effort into this album and just wanted to fully experiment with how far he could go with it. Overall, the puzzle gets a 4.5 out of 5. There's only one reason, and I'll admit this is a personal petty reason, but the reason it's not a 5 out of 5 is because it came out too late for my D&D game. And I could really have used a lot of the songs from this for that. But none the more for that. Now, in all seriousness, this is a 5 out of 5 album. It is an amazing listen. I knew I was going to be coming into it with something different to listen to, but it's good different. This is me knowing that Devin is not slowing down. He has everything in him. He is still going to be creating more and more, and I look forward to it. However, that is not all. As I said, this is just part 1. Part 2, we will be looking into Snuggles. Catch you next time. Like, you'd probably be dead from doing this much LSD. But none the more for that. That is a discussion for another time if anyone wants to request I somehow tie reviewing Paprika into reviewing music. But yes,